Welcome to another sermon on the book of Ruth. So, just to recap last time, Ruth Browning started off the series of Ruth, looking at Ruth 1, and the topic there was Ruth's return. So this passage looked at Naomi's travels to Bethlehem after she loses her husband and sons. So today we're going to be continuing on Ruth. This time we're going to be looking at Ruth chapter 2, and the topic for us tonight is Ruth's refuge. So, to kind of set the scene of where we are, the events of Ruth take place approximately between 1450 BC and 1000 BC, and Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David, and he was born in approximately 1040 BC. So let's give the passage a read through and go from there. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean to another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the woman who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the woman. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I come to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine and vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks from her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth, the Moabite, said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the woman who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the woman of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. There we go. Ruth is with Naomi. Naomi is in a terrible situation after the loss of her husband and sons. She is grieving. I'm sure you can all see there. And Naomi and Ruth are both considered poor. And we know this because Ruth is having to glean, which you can see up there. Gleaning is the act of picking up leftover or dropped grain or crop from the farmer's fields. However, it was clear that Ruth was doing whatever she could to try and feed herself and Naomi, however it turned out. The farm that she chooses, however, turns out to be quite an important part of the story. Naomi chooses to glean from a farm owned by the man called Boaz. Now, there is no way at this point that Ruth could know the importance of the decision to choose this particular farm. So Ruth gleaned from this farm, and she had no reason to expect anything other than the normal to occur at this point. Gleaning was a common practice at the time, and it was never expected to be a thriving career for Ruth or anybody else who gleaned. It was simply done to be able to eat. So she'd chosen the farm, and she'd started to glean. But this is where the next part of the story gets interesting. Because Ruth is then approached by the owner of the farm, Boaz, and she's unaware at this point that Boaz had asked the farm manager about Ruth. And Ruth at this point does not know that he has taken a keen interest in her. So Ruth at this point has no idea what Boaz is going to say to her. So I just want you to think for a second what you might be thinking if you're in this situation. So you've gone on somebody else's farm without asking, and then you're picking up leftover grain for yourself. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume that there's every chance that you might not be the farm owner's best friend, to be honest with you. You might even wonder if she could be accused of trespassing. I don't personally think that's too much of a stretch. But we learn from the passage that that's not what happens at all. Boaz is kind to Ruth because he's been told of the way that Ruth has looked after Naomi from the farm manager. Now, Boaz was related to Elimelech, Ruth's husband, and although we are not fully sure of the relation, it is clear that Boaz was fond of Elimelech. He was therefore happy to hear about the way that Ruth had looked after Naomi and looked on Ruth and the whole situation with kindness. So, not only did he not reprimand her or scare Ruth off in any way, but he wanted to help her. He said how grateful he was that she had looked after Naomi. And Boaz then, as we heard in the story, allowed Ruth to drink from the well that his workers had drank from. Now, this was not a common practice at this time at all. Ruth would not normally have been allowed anywhere near the well. She would normally have been considered a lower class citizen. That's really important to remember. But it did not stop there. She was also allowed to eat from their table. Boaz was treating Ruth with the utmost kindness. He was showing Ruth love. But the love and kindness did not even stop there. It did not even stop there. Boaz had also ordered his men to allow Ruth to glean from the farm each day, but he went even further than that. He ordered his men to drop grain on purpose for her. So just imagine for a second, right? You own this farm. This is your business. Grain is money. And you're literally ordering your men to drop grain in order that somebody else can pick it up, knowing that you will not profit a penny from this. He was showing his love in abundance to Ruth. And you can see how grateful she was for this. And then on top of that, he asks her to glean from the fields for the rest of the harvest. And after she comes home that day, she shows Naomi the amount of grain she has gleaned, which is around an ephah, which is equivalent today to around 35 litres of barley. That is a lot of barley. And Ruth told Naomi what happened. She was so encouraged by this and also urged Ruth to continue to glean from the same farm until the end of the harvest. So, what have we learned from this passage? I want to focus tonight on God's providence. And I think this passage is quite a strong example of this taking place. As I said before, Ruth could have chosen any farm. She had no way of knowing that Boaz was the owner of the farm, or even who Boaz was. She had never met him. However, she did choose this farm, and God clearly had a plan for Naomi and for Ruth. And it's important to remember that gleaning was a protected act in Leviticus, a reminder to be generous to the poor and the stranger. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleaning from your harvest. You shall leave them from the poor and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So, gleaning is a protected act by the Lord. He clearly promotes gleaning. And we can see here how the Lord is showing kindness to Ruth through Boaz here. To Ruth through Boaz. But caring about those in need isn't a new theme in the Bible. Think about Jesus. He fed the hungry in John 6:1-14. Famously fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish supplied to him by a small boy, a story I'm sure all of you know. And then Matthew 25:35 says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." Let's think about Ruth for a second. She was hungry. What did Boaz do? He gave her food. She was thirsty. He let her drink from the same well as the workers. She was a stranger, and yet he welcomed her. This is such an act of kindness. How good is our God? And the gospel message clearly shines through here. Jesus so clearly told us that the gospel message was available to all. And this is clearly the case here. She may have been poor. Ruth and Naomi may have been struggling. But just look how God was there for Ruth through Boaz. Jesus showed kindness to everyone, and this was mirrored here with Ruth and Naomi. And Jesus showed kindness to all he met, not just by supernatural acts, but sometimes he just ate with people, or fed them, or made them feel welcome. There are so many instances in the Bible where he is just showing love, and this is a perfect example of that being mirrored. And this all happened to Ruth, and she was blessed in abundance. But let's look at how we can apply this today. So let's look at the situation that Ruth had in front of her. We know that she had not known Boaz prior to gleaning on the farm, and she was just making sure that Naomi was being fed. And that was clear providence back then. But I would suggest that God's providence is just as applicable for us today. And I want to talk about the story that I've been through that I think helps. So, before I moved to Worcestershire, I'd never been to the West Midlands at all. Sorry, everybody, I didn't know where it was. I didn't even know where Worcester was. And at the time, I was working down in Somerset as an assistant manager in McDonald's. And at the time, going to be honest, I had no intention of leaving the profession or moving away. But God had different ideas. And it was so clear now, when I look back, how obvious God's providence was in my life. I had been looking for a partner for a while, but never seriously when I was down in Somerset. I wanted to marry a Christian, that I knew. However, I never seemed to have that much success at this time. But it was God's providence that in September of 2019, I would go on Christian Connection, and it was God's providence that when I would scroll through, I would scroll upon a certain person's profile that just for a second stops me and makes me think, okay, I'll message her. And then it's God's providence that after we start dating, that even though we'd never met before or knew anything about each other, that two of her very closest friends were already very close friends with my grandparents. I mean, it's God's providence that we unknowingly, when we were younger, played in the same park, possibly even at the same time with one another without knowing. We're not sure. But it doesn't stop there. It's also God's providence that we chose St. Peter's Baptist Church as a wedding venue, because we were looking at it purely as a venue to get married, first of all. We knew it was God's providence because Ali and I had no idea that Vicky Golding, who we didn't know, had not already met Ali, but had actually remembered Ali attending her wedding as a younger girl. So I think it was God's providence that Vicky was to sing at our wedding. And, I could say that God's providence had stopped there, but he has been so, so good. It has blessed me and Ali time and time again since we've been married. He's put us in the right place at the right time on so many occasions. I couldn't even list them. Whether that has been to talk to somebody on the street or to pray with someone struggling, he's always been there. He's blessed us with a home to live in. And if we need a holiday, God has always provided one for us. And I want to make something clear. I am not saying any of these things to brag. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. Don't you see? God's providence is all around us. Have a think about some of the small things in life that have somehow just worked out and fitted together. I'm sure you all have examples. Have a think about those so-called coincidences. You were probably thinking at the time, oh, I'm so glad that train was cancelled because it means I could do this instead. Or, I can't believe all our plans fitted together in such a random way, and it meant that we're able to have such a wonderful day in a way that we could never imagine or would never have thought of. We've all had these moments where things have just worked out for the better, but in a way that we couldn't expect. And I'm going to say, these things don't have to be groundbreaking. In fact, it's normally the small things that we miss, I would suggest, that can have a huge impact on our lives. So that is God's providence. I want to encourage you all tonight, as we close, to really think, where has God worked in your life? Where can you look back on a time, a situation, or a circumstance and think, actually, yeah, I can see God in that. We are so blessed to have a God who knows exactly what is best for us. And sometimes it might not be so obvious, but that does not mean he isn't working in all of our lives.